Before we descend into the frozen streets of Helsinki and the clandestine world of signal intelligence, if you enjoy uncovering the lost secrets of the Cold War and the stories they tried to bury, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us dig deeper into the archives to bring you these reports. On the night of November 14, 1981, the wind howling off the Gulf of Finland was cold enough to crack the pavement. Helsinki was a city of long shadows and whispered conversations, a neutral ground where East met West in a delicate, high-stakes dance. While diplomats toasted with vodka in the grand ballrooms of the Hotel Kemp, a different kind of war was being fought in the airwaves above the city. It was a war of frequencies, encryption, and silence. And on this particular Tuesday, that war was about to be crashed by three engineering students who had no idea they were walking into the crosshairs of the Soviet Union's most ruthless intelligence directorate. Elias Vainio was 22 years old, a third-year student of electrical engineering at the Helsinki University of Technology. By all accounts, Elias was brilliant but socially invisible. He was the kind of young man who preferred the company of vacuum tubes and soldering irons to people. He lived in a cramped attic apartment in the Kallio district, a space that smelled permanently of ozone and stale coffee. The apartment was less a home and more a laboratory. The walls were lined with shelves groaning under the weight of scavenged electronics, oscilloscopes, signal generators, and the centerpiece of his existence, a modified Hallicrafters receiver connected to a massive copper wire antenna he had illegally strung across the snowy roof of the building. Elias wasn't looking for spies. He was a DXer, a hobbyist obsessed with catching long-distance radio signals from the far corners of the globe. His logbook was filled with timestamps from stations in Australia, Patagonia, and Japan. But on that night in November, Elias wasn't picking up a jazz station from New Orleans or a weather report from Tokyo. He was tuning through the dead bands, the frequencies usually reserved for atmospheric noise, when he heard it. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't the rhythmic tapping of Morse code. It was a sound that shouldn't have existed. It was a low mechanical thrumming, like a heavy engine idling, punctuated every 11 seconds by a sharp digital chirp. It was sitting on 4625 kHz, a frequency that was supposed to be empty. Elias adjusted the gain on his receiver. The signal was strong, impossibly strong. In the world of radio, signal strength usually meant proximity. A signal this clear wasn't bouncing off the ionosphere from halfway around the world. It was coming from somewhere nearby, somewhere in the city. He put on his headphones and hit the record button on his reel-to-reel tape deck. He watched the needles on the VU meter jump with every chirp. 0345. Most people would have tuned past it. They would have assumed it was industrial interference, perhaps a faulty generator at the shipyard or a welder working late. But Elias knew the texture of interference. Interference was chaotic, random. This was structured. This was artificial. It had a heartbeat. He spent the next 4 hours listening. At 2:15 a.m., the pattern changed. The thrumming stopped abruptly, replaced by a sudden harsh blast of white noise that lasted exactly 8 seconds. Then, a voice cut through the static. It was a woman's voice speaking Russian. Her tone was flat, metallic, devoid of any human inflection. She recited a string of numbers, 82, 14, 99, 06. She repeated the sequence twice. Then the thrumming returned. The digital chirps resumed. Elias sat back in his chair, his breath fogging in the cold air of the attic. He had heard of numbers stations before, ghostly broadcasts used by intelligence agencies to send one-way messages to agents in the field. But those usually operated on known frequencies, well documented by the hobbyist community. This was different. This was a direct high-power transmission originating from within a neutral capital city, broadcasting on a frequency that technically didn't exist on the official allocation charts. He didn't know it yet, but he had just stumbled upon Operation Glass, a KGB communication node that the Central Intelligence Agency had been trying to locate for 3 years. And because he was an engineer, not a spy, he made his first mistake. He didn't turn off the radio. He didn't forget about it. He decided he was going to find out where it was coming from. The next morning, the sunlight in Helsinki was a pale, watery gray that barely illuminated the streets. Elias arrived at the university cafeteria with his eyes rimmed in red, carrying the reel-to-reel tape in his backpack as if it were a holy relic. He was looking for two people. The first was Timo Järvinen. Timo was a large, boisterous student who specialized in antenna theory and hardware modification. Where Elias was the precision instrument, Timo was the hammer. He could build a transmitter out of a toaster if he had to. He drove a battered Saab 96 that was more rust than steel, and he had a reputation for climbing onto university roofs to install unauthorized repeaters. The second was Anya Koskinen. Anya was a mathematics major with a minor in cryptography. She was quiet, intense, and possessed a mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. She was one of the few women in the advanced mathematics program, and she had to fight for every ounce of respect she got, which made her sharper and more cynical than her peers. Elias found them at a corner table, arguing about the efficiency of a new Soviet radar system described in a technical journal. Without a word, Elias placed the tape deck on the table, plugged it into a portable battery, and handed Timo the headphones. Timo listened for 30 seconds, his chewing slowing to a stop. He frowned, adjusted the headset, and listened again. He handed the headphones to Anya. She listened for a full minute, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the rhythm of the chirps. "It's not random," Anya said, pulling the headphones off. "The interval between the chirps isn't constant. It varies by milliseconds. It's a carrier signal, but there's data encoded in the timing." "It's Russian," Timo added. "The voice, that's a Leningrad dialect, but the signal strength..." "Elias, where did you record this?" "My attic," Elias whispered, "with the loop antenna." Timo's eyes went wide. "That antenna has zero gain. If you picked it up that clearly, the transmitter isn't in Russia. It's here, in Helsinki, Euro 722. The implication hung in the air. A clandestine high-power transmitter operating inside Finland was a violation of international treaties and Finnish sovereignty. But more importantly, it was a piece of engineering that fascinated them. "We can find it," Timo said, a grin spreading across his face. "If it's broadcasting that hot, we can triangulate it. We just need 3 receivers, one in Kallio, one here at the university in Otaniemi, and one somewhere in the east, maybe Itäkeskus." "It's encrypted," Anya said, tapping the tape deck. "The numbers are a one-time pad, unbreakable without the key. But the chirps, the variance in the timing, that might be something else. That might be a handshake protocol. If we can map the signal, we don't need to read the message to know who it's talking to." They didn't discuss going to the police. In 1981 Finland, the police were officially neutral, but politically cautious. Reporting a Soviet spy station was a good way to get patted on the head and told to focus on your studies, or worse, to attract the attention of the Finnish Security Intelligence Service, who would simply shut them down to avoid a diplomatic incident. "We do it ourselves," Elias said. "We map it, we find the source, then we decide what to do." For the next 2 weeks, the 3 students turned Timo's rusted Saab into a mobile direction-finding unit. They mounted a rotating loop antenna on the roof, disguised as a ski rack. Inside, the passenger seat was removed to make room for a spectrum analyzer borrowed, without permission, from the university lab. They drove through the freezing nights, traversing the grid of the city. They parked in alleyways, on dockyards, and in the shadow of the massive icebreakers in the harbor. They plotted signal vectors on a large topographic map of Helsinki. The lines on the map began to converge. They didn't point to the Soviet embassy on Tehtankatu, which would have been the obvious choice. They didn't point to the consulate or the trade mission. The lines crossed in an upscale residential neighborhood in Kaivopuisto, directly over a large, unassuming villa surrounded by high hedges and a security gate. The villa was registered to a private import-export firm called Baltic Horizon. 11:15. "It's a commercial front," Anya realized as they sat in the car, watching the house from a safe distance. They aren't broadcasting from the embassy because the embassy is watched 24/7. They moved the transmitter to a private residence to hide it in the noise of the city. They had found the KGB's secret ear in Helsinki, but finding it was one thing. Getting anyone to believe them was another. The American embassy in Helsinki was a fortress of concrete and glass, a symbol of Western power sitting uncomfortably close to the Soviet border. Elias, Timo, and Anya stood outside the heavy security gates on a Tuesday morning, clutching a manila envelope containing their maps, frequency logs, and analysis. They had debated who to approach. The British? Too secretive. The Finns? too compromised. The Americans, they reasoned, were the ones who would care the most. They were the ones the KGB was targeting. They asked to speak to the naval attaché, a common cover for intelligence officers. After 3 hours of waiting in a sterile holding room, they were escorted into a small, windowless office. The man sitting behind the desk introduced himself as Mr. Harrison. He was in his late 40s, wearing a suit that looked expensive but tired. He had the weary, condescending look of a bureaucrat who had dealt with too many cranks and conspiracy theorists. "So," Harrison said, leafing through their meticulously drawn maps without really looking at them. "You kids think you found a radio station." "Not a station," Elias corrected, his voice trembling slightly. "A node. It's a high-frequency relay system. They are using burst transmission to send data to field agents, but the carrier wave is always active. It's coming from the villa in Puisto." Harrison sighed. He tossed the file onto the desk. "Look, I appreciate the civic spirit, really. But do you know how much RF interference there is in this city? We have radars, maritime comms, diplomatic channels. What you're hearing is likely a harmonic echo from the shipyard generators. It happens all the time." "It's not a harmonic," Timo snapped, his temper flaring. "I built the loop antenna myself. The null point is sharp. The signal is directional. And the modulation? 1540. Harrison held up a hand. "We have experts, son. Men with millions of dollars of equipment. If the Soviets were broadcasting from a private house in Puisto, we would know. We don't need college students telling us how to do signals intelligence." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Go back to school. Focus on your exams. Leave the spy games to the professionals." They were escorted out of the embassy, humiliated. As they stood on the sidewalk, the cold wind biting at their faces, Elias felt a knot of anger tighten in his stomach. It wasn't just the dismissal, it was the arrogance. Harrison hadn't even listened to the tape. He hadn't looked at the timing variants Anya had found. "They're deaf," Anya said, staring at the embassy's massive antenna array on the roof. "They have all that gear, and they're looking at the wrong frequencies. They're monitoring the embassy channels, not the dead bands." "He called us kids," Timo muttered, kicking a pile of dirty snow. "He thinks we're just playing with toys." Elias looked at his friends. He saw the same spark in their eyes that he felt in his own chest. It was the stubborn refusal of the engineer who knows the math is right, even when the world says it's wrong. "They won't believe us because we don't have proof," Elias said. "Maps aren't proof. Tapes aren't proof." "What is proof?" Anya asked. Elias looked toward the radio tower in the distance. "Interaction. If we can make the signal react to us, if we can make the KGB blink, then the Americans will have to look." "Are you suggesting we jam them?" Timo asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "No," Elias said. "Jamming is crude. They'll just switch frequencies. I'm suggesting we talk to them. I'm suggesting we pretend to be one of their agents." The plan was dangerous. It was illegal. It was, in retrospect, insanely reckless. But to 3 students fueled by rejection and caffeine, it seemed like the only logical next step. They needed to build a transmitter capable of mimicking the KGB's signal. The hardware wasn't the problem. Timo could modify a ham radio transceiver to hit the 4625 kHz frequency. The problem was the encryption. They couldn't fake the voice messages. The one-time pads were unbreakable without the key. If they sent a random string of numbers, the receiving agents would know it was fake immediately because it wouldn't decode. 1955. But Anya had noticed something else on the tapes. Before every voice transmission, there was a specific digital handshake, a series of 3 distinct tones that signaled the receiver to wake up and record. "We don't send a message," Anya explained, sketching a diagram on a napkin in the university cafeteria. "We send a keep alive signal. We mimic the handshake but with a slight variation. We make their system think there's a technical fault. If we do it right, the operators at the villa will have to run diagnostics. They'll have to break radio silence or increase power to compensate." They set up their operation in an abandoned maintenance shed near the Helsinki shoreline, miles away from Elias's apartment to avoid triangulation. Timo rigged a directional Yagi antenna, aiming it directly across the city toward the villa in Puisto. On the night of December 3rd, they were ready. The wind was whipping off the sea, rattling the corrugated metal walls of the shed. Elias sat at the controls, his hand hovering over the key. Timo monitored the output power. Anya watched the frequency analyzer. Target signal is active, Anya said, watching the green line on the scope. Standard idle pattern. Ready for injection, Elias said. Do it, Timo whispered. Elias keyed the mic. They didn't speak. Instead, they played a recording they had synthesized, a perfect replica of the KGB's digital handshake, but played at 1.5 times the normal speed. It was a ghost signal, designed to confuse the automatic gain control of the Soviet receivers. They transmitted for exactly 5 seconds, then cut the power. Silence. On the spectrum analyzer, the KGB signal continued its steady thrumming. Nothing, Timo said, disappointed. They ignored it. Wait, Anya said. Her eyes were glued to the screen. Look at the sidebands. 10 seconds later, the KGB signal shifted. The thrumming stopped. Then it surged back, but at double the power. The needle on their receiver pinned to the red. They're boosting, Elias said. They think the signal is degrading. They're shouting to be heard over the interference. Send it again, Anya commanded. Shift the frequency up by 2 kilohertz. Elias sent the burst again. This time the reaction was immediate. The KGB transmitter cut out completely. The frequency went dead. 2310. Did we break it? Timo asked. Suddenly, a new signal appeared. Not on 4625 kHz, but on 4630 kHz. It was the same thrumming, but erratic. Then, a voice cut through. Not the automated woman, but a male voice speaking urgent, angry Russian. Unit 4, confirm integrity. We have unauthorized harmonic on the primary. Switching to backup. The students stared at each other. They hadn't just made the KGB blink. They had forced a human operator to break protocol and speak on an open line. We have them, Elias breathed. We have them reacting to us. But they had done more than that. By forcing the KGB to boost power and switch frequencies erratically, they had created a massive electromagnetic footprint. Across the city, in the basement of the American embassy, automated listening posts that ignored the quiet, dead bands would have suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree due to the power surge. The students packed up their gear in record time, dismantling the antenna and throwing everything into the back of the Saab. They drove away into the night, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They felt triumphant. They didn't notice the dark sedan parked 2 streets away, its headlights off, the occupants watching the maintenance shed through night vision binoculars. The euphoria lasted for 2 days. Then, the reality of what they had done began to set in. Elias was the first to notice. He was walking home from the university library when he saw a man standing at the bus stop across from his apartment building. The man wasn't waiting for a bus. He was reading a newspaper, but he never turned the page. He wore a gray wool coat and a hat pulled low. Elias kept walking, passing his building. He circled the block and returned 10 minutes later. The man was still there. Paranoia is a slow, creeping frost. Elias went inside, locked his door, and drew the blinds. He checked his radio equipment. Everything seemed normal, but the silence of the room felt heavy. The next day, Timo called him from a payphone. Don't talk, Timo said, his voice tight. Just listen. Someone broke into my car last night. Did they take the radio? Elias asked. No, Timo said. They didn't take anything. They just moved things. The glove box was open. The seats were reclined, and they left something. A cigarette butt on the dashboard. A distinct brand. Russian tobacco. 2745. It was a message. A clumsy, brutal message. We know who you are. We can get to you. They met in the bustling chaos of the central railway station, the only place they felt safe from eavesdropping. Anya looked pale. I was followed, she said quietly. In the library stacks. A woman. She kept appearing in every aisle I went to. She didn't look at books. She looked at me. We need to go to the police, Timo said. Or back to the Americans. The Americans laughed at us, Elias reminded him. And the police will arrest us for illegal broadcasting before they investigate the Soviets. If we go to the authorities now, we have to admit we provoked a foreign power. So what do we do? Anya asked. Wait for them to grab us off the street? Elias looked at the departures board, the destination names flipping over with a mechanical clatter. He realized they had underestimated the enemy. They treated this as an engineering problem, a game of signal and response. But the KGB didn't play games. They eliminated variables. They haven't hurt us yet, Elias reasoned. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. They're trying to scare us. They want to know who we're working for. They can't imagine 3 students did this alone. They think we're CIA or MI6. That makes it worse, Anya said. If they think we're spies, they'll interrogate us like spies. We have one card left to play, Elias said, his mind racing. The CIA didn't believe us because they didn't see the threat. Now we have the KGB's attention. We need to bring the two together. We need to make the KGB do something so public, so undeniable, that the Americans have to intervene. How? Timo asked. We don't just inject noise this time, Elias said. We inject a message, a specific message. We use their own one-time pad system against them. We can't crack the pad, Anya argued. We don't need to crack it, Elias said. We just need to repeat a sequence they've already used but change the destination. We make them think a package is being dropped, a package they have to retrieve immediately. Where? Elias smiled grimly. Somewhere the Americans are always watching. The plan relied on the KGB's obsession with protocol. Anya had spent the last week analyzing the number sequences. She found that certain prefixes always correlated with physical movement, couriers leaving the villa shortly after a broadcast. Prefix 821, Anya said, pointing to her notebook. Every time 821 is broadcast, a car leaves the villa within an hour and goes to the industrial district. It's a pickup command. So we broadcast 821, Elias said, but we add a location coordinate. They decided on the Sibelius Monument. It was a famous abstract sculpture in a park in the Turlo district, a mass of hollow steel pipes that looked like sound waves frozen in metal. It was a tourist landmark, but at night, it was desolate. Crucially, it was located less than a mile from the Soviet trade mission, and more importantly, it was on a direct line of sight from the roof of the American Embassy's residency, 3220. They knew the Americans had cameras trained on the park because it was a known meeting spot for low-level diplomatic exchanges. We need to simulate a panic drop, Anya explained. In spycraft, if an agent is compromised, they do a panic drop, dumping all their intel at a pre-arranged emergency site. We need to make the KGB believe their top agent is burning his cover and dumping the goods at the monument tonight. Timo modified the transmitter again. This time, they needed more power. He cannibalized 3 microwave ovens to build a signal amplifier. It was unstable and dangerous. It would likely melt the transmitter after one use, but it would scream across the radio spectrum loud enough to wake the dead. On the night of December 8th, the city was buried in a fresh blizzard. Visibility was near zero. The students drove the Saab to a parking garage in Melati, the highest point they could find with a clear line of sight to the villa. Elias set up the transmitter in the trunk. The smell of hot electronics filled the cold air. This is it, Elias said. Once we flip this switch, every radio direction finder in the city will point at us. We have 3 minutes to broadcast, then we run. Anya checked her watch. Injecting in 3, 2, 1. Elias hit the switch. The hum of the amplifier was so loud they could feel it in their teeth. They broadcast the sequence. 82, 1, 77, Sibelius, 00. They repeated it 4 times. The lights in the parking garage flickered as the massive RF pulse drained the local grid. Smoke began to curl from the trunk of the Saab. That's it! It's frying! Timo yelled, yanking the power cables. They jumped into the car. Timo slammed it into gear, and they screeched out of the garage, tires spinning on the ice. They didn't go home. They drove to a spot overlooking the Sibelius Park. They parked the car, covered it with a tarp, and hiked up a small hill where they could see the monument through the swirling snow. They waited. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The steel pipes of the monument moaned in the wind. Then headlights cut through the dark. A black Volga sedan, unmistakable as a Soviet diplomatic vehicle, tore around the corner. It jumped the curb, sliding across the frozen grass, and screeched to a halt right in front of the monument. 3 men jumped out. They weren't moving like diplomats. They were moving like soldiers. They had flashlights and were frantically searching the base of the sculpture, ripping through the snow, looking for the non-existent package. 3610. Suddenly, a spotlight from a nearby rooftop, the American residency, snapped on, bathing the park in blinding white light. The Soviet agents froze. A loudspeaker crackled. "This is private property. Identify yourselves." The trap had sprung. But Elias, watching from the hill, realized something terrifying. The Soviets weren't retreating. One of the men reached into his coat. He wasn't pulling out a badge. He was pulling out a suppressed pistol. The students had wanted to get the Americans' attention. They had succeeded, but they had also just started a shooting war in a public park, and they were the only witnesses. The gunshot was not the thunderous boom Elias expected. In the damp, snow-muffled air of the park, it was a sharp, flat crack, like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. From their vantage point on the hill, the 3 students watched in frozen horror. The Soviet agent in the black coat hadn't fired at the American residency. He had fired into the air, a warning shot, or perhaps a signal, but the reaction from the rooftop was instantaneous. The spotlight didn't waver, but the voice on the loudspeaker changed tone, dropping the bureaucratic warning for a sharp, tactical command. "Federal agents, drop the weapon. You are surrounded." The park, usually a sanctuary of silence in the bustling city, erupted into chaos. Sirens began to wail in the distance, a converging chorus of Helsinki police and diplomatic security. The 3 Soviet agents scrambled back into the Volga. The driver didn't bother reversing. He stomped on the accelerator, jumping the curb and tearing across the pedestrian lawn, the sedan's tires churning up plumes of mud and dirty snow. They careened onto Mechelininkhatu Street, narrowly missing a late-night tram, and vanished into the darkness of the city. "We have to go," Timo hissed, grabbing Elias by the jacket. "Now, before the police seal the perimeter." They scrambled down the backside of the hill, slipping on the ice, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They reached the Saab, tore the tarp off, and threw themselves inside. Timo didn't turn on the headlights. He navigated the back alleys of Turlo by the ambient glow of the street lamps, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the steering wheel. They didn't stop until they reached the industrial harbor in Hernesaari, miles away from the diplomatic district. Timo killed the engine behind a stack of shipping containers. The silence that filled the car was heavy, suffocating. "They had guns," Anya whispered, staring out the frosted window. "Real guns. They were going to shoot. They thought they were walking into a trap set by the CIA," Elias said, his voice hollow. "We simulated a drop. They thought their agent was turning over the goods. When the spotlight hit them, they panicked. We caused an international incident," Timo said, gripping the steering wheel. "Do you understand? This isn't radio piracy anymore. This is war. If they find us, we disappear. Both sides will want us. The Americans to shut us up, the Soviets to kill us." Elias looked at his friends. The thrill of the engineering challenge was gone, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of survival. He realized then that they couldn't go back to their apartments. The KGB knew who they were, or at least they knew enough to find them eventually. The cigarette butt in Timo's car had been the warning. Tonight was the escalation. "We can't go home," Elias said, "and we can't go to the university. They'll be watching the labs." "Where do we go?" Anya asked. Elias looked at the towering cranes of the shipyard, the listening post, the old civil defense bunker in Katajanoka. "My uncle used to work maintenance there. He gave me a key years ago to store my equipment. It's underground, shielded. No radio signals go in or out unless we want them to." It was a desperate plan. The bunker was a relic of the Second World War, cold, damp, and forgotten. But it was invisible. As they drove toward their new sanctuary, the radio in the dashboard crackled. It was the news. The announcer's voice was calm, oblivious to the terror they had just witnessed. Reports of a disturbance in Sibelius Park are being described by police as a car accident involving a foreign diplomat. No injuries are reported. In other news, "A car accident?" Anya scoffed bitter laughter. "They're burying it, the Americans and the Soviets. They're both pretending it didn't happen. That's bad, Elias said grimly. If they were fighting publicly, we might be safe. But if they're burying it, it means the operation is still active. It means the KGB hasn't given up on whatever they're hiding, and they're going to tear the city apart looking for the people who exposed them. The bunker smelled of wet concrete and rust. It was a cavernous space beneath an old warehouse, lit by a single string of flickering incandescent bulbs. They dragged their equipment inside: the Hallicrafter's receiver, the spectrum analyzer, the modified microwave amplifier. It looked less like a laboratory and more like the cockpit of a spaceship that had crashed in a dungeon. For 3 days, they lived like rats. They slept on old canvas cots and ate cold canned soup, but they didn't stop working. If anything, the isolation sharpened their focus. They had the tapes, they had the logs, and now they had context. Anya spent 40 hours straight working on the number sequences. She had covered the concrete walls with chalk, writing out strings of data, looking for the mathematical key that unlocked the cipher. It's not just a one-time pad, she announced on the 4th morning, her eyes red-rimmed and manic. I was wrong. The numbers aren't the message. The numbers are the address. Elias and Timo looked up from the heater they were trying to fix. What do you mean? Look at the timing variance again, Anya said, pointing to a graph she had drawn. The chirps. The digital handshake. It's a carrier wave for a secondary signal, a sub-carrier. The voice reading the numbers is just distraction. It keeps the human monitors busy writing down 821 while the machine talks to another machine in the background. Steganography, Elias realized. Hiding a message inside another message. Exactly. And I decoded the sub-carrier. She threw a notebook onto the table. It wasn't filled with military positions or troop movements. It was a list of names, bank account numbers, and flight times. What is this? Timo asked. It's a payroll, Anya said, but not for spies. These are Finnish officials, customs officers at the airport, dock workers, police lieutenants, and... She pointed to a name at the bottom. Assistant Director of the Ministry of Communications. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp bunker. They aren't just spying on Finland. They're buying it. They're building a network to move something through the country, something big. Operation Glass isn't a listening post, Elias said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Glass. What is glass? It's transparent. It's a conduit. They're moving high-tech contraband, Timo said. Computer chips, guidance systems, things the West embargoed. They're smuggling forbidden technology from the West into the Soviet Union through Helsinki, and they've bribed the border guards to look the other way. And the signal, Anja added, is the logistics network. It tells the bribed officials when the shipments are moving. That's why they panicked at the park. We didn't just interrupt a chat. We threatened a multi-million-dollar smuggling ring. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just espionage. It was organized crime on a geopolitical scale. And the Americans, Mr. Harrison at the embassy, had missed it because they were looking for political secrets, not a black market invoice. We have to tell someone, Timo said. But who? If the police are on this list, we tell the only person who can't be bribed, Elias said. We tell the machine. What machine? The Americans have a surveillance satellite that passes over Helsinki every 90 minutes, Elias said. The KH-11. It listens to microwave bursts. If we can't walk into the embassy, we'll talk to their sky. The plan was technically impossible, which was the only reason Elias thought it might work. They couldn't transmit voice to a satellite. They didn't have the frequency codes, but the KH-11 was designed to detect radar signatures. If they could create a specific pattern of radar pulses, Morse code written in microwave bursts, the satellite's automated systems would flag it as an anomaly and dump the data directly onto a desk at the National Reconnaissance Office in Virginia. But they needed a transmitter powerful enough to punch through the atmosphere. The microwave ovens wouldn't cut it. The University Radio Observatory, Timo said. In Metsahovi, it has a 14-meter dish. It's designed for radio astronomy, but the emitter can be retuned. It's guarded, Anya said, by a sleepy grad student and a chain-link fence, Timo countered. I have a master key for the maintenance gate. I made it last year when I wanted to impress a girl. They left the bunker at midnight. The The city was asleep, a frozen landscape of blue and white. They took the Saab, driving north out of the city limits, into the deep forests where the observatory sat in a clearing, its massive white dish pointed at the stars like a giant ear. They ditched the car a mile out and hiked through the snow. The forest was silent, save for the crunch of their boots. When they reached the perimeter, Timo worked the lock on the gate. It clicked open. They sprinted across the clearing to the control building. Inside, the warm hum of server racks greeted them. The grad student on duty was asleep in a chair, headphones around his neck. Timo moved quietly, bypassing him and heading for the server room. "We have 10 minutes before the satellite crests the horizon," Elias whispered, his fingers flying across the control console. "Anya, give me the coordinates." "Azimuth 180, elevation 45, she recited. "Frequency 12.4 gigahertz. The massive dish outside began to groan as the motors engaged, slowly tilting toward the southern horizon. Inside the control room, the grad student stirred. He blinked, pulled off his headphones, and saw the three figures hunched over the console. "Hey!" he shouted, jumping up. "What are you doing? Who are you?" "Sit down," Timo barked, spinning around. He didn't have a weapon, so he held up a soldering iron like a knife. "We are conducting a calibration test. Sit down and be quiet." The student, terrified by the wild-eyed giant in the parka, slumped back into his chair. "Satellite in range," Anja called out. 2 minutes. Elias began typing the message. It was short, concise. Project Glass, contraband pipeline, Kaivo Puisto Villa, data enclosed. He hit the transmit key. The dish vibrated. A beam of concentrated microwave energy shot up into the ionosphere, carrying the decoded list of names and the frequency data Anya had uncovered. For 60 seconds they broadcasted. Then the screen flashed. "Transmission complete." "We did it," Elias breathed. But the victory was short-lived. The phone on the wall began to ring. Then the emergency lights flashed red. "External proximity alarm," the grad student stammered. "Someone breached the main gate." Elias looked at the monitors. A convoy of 3 vehicles was tearing up the access road. They weren't police cars. They were unmarked sedans. "The KGB," Anya said. "They were monitoring the spectrum. They saw the dish move." "How did they get here so fast?" Timo asked. "They didn't," Elias said. "They were already hunting us. They just needed a flare to see where we were." The control building was a concrete block, sturdy but not a fortress. Elias locked the heavy steel door and jammed a chair under the handle. "Is there a back way out?" he asked the student. "Just the ventilation hatch in the generator room," the student stammered. "But it comes out in the parking lot." Outside, tires screeched on the gravel. Doors slammed. There was no shouting, no "open up," just the sound of heavy footsteps on the metal stairs and then a deafening thud as something heavy rammed the door. "They're breaking in," Timo said. He looked around the room, frantic. "We need a weapon." "We're in an observatory," Anja yelled. "We have telescopes and computers." "We have the dish," Elias said. A crazy idea formed in his mind. "The emitter, it's still charged." So it's a 20-kilowatt microwave beam," Elias said. "If we point it down, at the door." "That's insane," Timo said. "You'll cook us." "It's directional," Elias argued. "The leakage is minimal behind the feed horn, but anything in front of it." The door buckled under another blow. A hinge snapped. "Do it," Anya screamed. Elias slammed his hands on the console, overriding the safety interlocks. He slewed the massive dish. Outside, the gears ground in protest as the dish tilted drastically, aiming its focal point not at the sky, but at the entrance of the building itself. He maxed the gain. "Cover your ears! Close your eyes!" He hit the pulse button. A sound like tearing canvas ripped through the air. The lights in the control room exploded. The air instantly smelled of ozone and burning metal. Outside, there was a scream, not of pain, but of shock. The microwave burst had induced a massive electrical current in the metal door and the battering ram the agents were using. Sparks showered the entryway. The electronics in the KGB cars in the parking lot fried instantly. Headlights bursting, horns blaring uncontrollably. Elias kept the button down for 5 seconds, then killed it. Silence. "Go!" Elias shouted. "Ventilation hatch! Now!" They scrambled into the back room. Timo kicked the grate open. They squeezed through the narrow tunnel, crawling over cables and pipes, and tumbled out into the snow on the far side of the building. The scene in the front was chaotic. The KGB cars were smoking. The agents were staggering, disoriented by the concussive effect of the arc flash. "Run into the trees," Elias commanded. They sprinted into the dark forest, the snow waist-deep in places. They didn't look back. They ran until their lungs burned, until the observatory was just a white glow in the distance. They reached the road where they had left the Saab, but they didn't stop. They kept moving, deeper into the woods, knowing that if they stopped, they froze. An hour later, shivering and near collapse, they saw headlights. A vehicle was moving slowly down the logging road. They dove into a ditch. The vehicle stopped. It was a black van. The side door slid open. "Elias Vinyo," a voice called out. It was American. "You can come out. We saw the signal." Elias hesitated. "Who are you?" A man stepped out into the snow. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing tactical gear. "I'm the guy who believes you," the man said. "Get in. You're freezing to death." The safe house was a windowless room in the basement of the U.S. Embassy. It was warm, dry, and smelled of coffee. Elias, Timo, and Anya sat at a metal table, wrapped in wool blankets. Across from them sat the man from the woods, Agent Miller, and the skeptical Mr. Harrison, who now looked very pale and very quiet. "You kids," Miller said, pacing the room, "are either the smartest idiots I've ever met or the luckiest." He threw a file on the table. It was the list Anya had decoded. "This?" Miller tapped the paper. "This is gold, pure gold. We knew the Soviets were moving tech. We didn't know how. We suspected the diplomatic pouch, maybe submarines. We didn't know they had bought half the customs authority at Vanta Airport." "The radio signal," Elias said, his voice raspy. "It was the coordination." "Yes," Miller said, "an automated traffic control system for smugglers, and you just blew it wide open." "What happens now?" Anja asked. "Now?" Miller smiled. "Now the Finnish police, the ones who aren't on this list, are raiding the villa in Kaivopuisto. The KGB residents are claiming diplomatic immunity, but it won't matter. The network is burned. The pipeline is shut down." Harrison cleared his throat. We owe you an apology and a debt." "We don't want money," Timo said. "We want our lives back." Miller stopped pacing. He looked at them with a somber expression. "That's the one thing I can't give you. Not fully. The KGB doesn't forget. You embarrassed them. You cost them billions in technology. If you stay in Helsinki, you'll be looking over your shoulders for the rest of your lives." "So we have to leave?" Elias asked. "We can set you up," Miller offered. "MIT has a great engineering program. We can get you visas, scholarships, new identities if you want them. Or you can stay here, and we can provide security, but..." Elias looked at Anya and Timo. They were students. They had families. They had lives. "I'm not running," Anya said firmly. "This is my country. I'm not letting them chase me out." "Me neither," Timo said. "Besides, who's going to fix my Saab?" Elias nodded. "We stay. But we want protection, and we want the equipment, all of it. The receivers, the analyzers. If they come back, we want to hear them coming." Miller nodded slowly. "Fair enough. We'll put a watch on you. And Mr. Harrison here is going to make sure your tuition is paid for, indefinitely." 6 months later, the villa in Kaivopuisto was empty. The Baltic Horizon import firm had dissolved. The mysterious antenna array on the roof was dismantled. On 4625 kHz, there was only static. The thrumming engine was gone. The woman's voice was silent. Elias graduated with honors. He went on to work for Nokia, helping to design the early mobile phone networks that would eventually cover the globe. He became a legend in the engineering department, though no one knew exactly why. He was just the quiet guy who knew more about RF propagation than the professors. Timo opened a radio repair shop in Kallio. It became a gathering place for DXers and hobbyists. He kept a modified receiver under the counter, always tuned to the dead bands, just in case. Anya went into academia. She published papers on cryptography and number theory. She never married, but she and Elias remained close, meeting for coffee every Tuesday, the day they first heard the signal. They never spoke publicly about what happened in the winter of 1981. The official story remained a diplomatic incident involving a car crash and a power surge at the observatory. The CIA archives classified the Metsahovi incident as top secret, burying the details of the 3 students who outsmarted the GRU. But years later, in the late 1990s, a new signal appeared on a different frequency, broadcasting from a location deep within Russia. It was a buzzer, followed by a voice reading names. Elias was sitting in his office at Nokia when he heard it on a spectrum analyzer he kept on his desk. He listened to the rhythm, the digital handshake. He smiled. It was different. Stronger. But the math was the same. He picked up the phone and dialed Anya. "Did you hear it?" he asked. "I heard it," she replied. "Do we do anything?" There was a long pause on the line. They were older now. The Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall was dust, and the Soviet Union was a memory. But the game never really ended. "No," Anya said finally. "Let the new kids find it. It's their turn." Elias hung up the phone. He reached over and turned off the analyzer. He looked out the window at the snow falling on Helsinki, the white flakes drifting down like static from the sky. He thought about the freezing attic, the terror in the park, the blinding light of the microwave dish. He realized then that they hadn't just tricked the KGB. They had touched the invisible pulse of the world, held it in their hands for a moment, and changed the beat. And that was enough.